In this video I'm going to be building myself a new home server based around this case here, which has been generously provided by Server Case UK. My current home server is a Fujitsu Primergy TX1310M1, which is a tower server which I have sitting in a rack on a rack shelf, and it's honestly bugged me since I got that it's a tower server on a rack shelf and not a proper rack mount server. The difficulty I have with my rack is that it's quite short depth. Because I have it in my living room, I don't want a huge full depth rack, so the one I've got is only about 600mm deep, and when you take into account the space required at the front and the back for cables, any server over 500mm deep will not fit in that rack, and even at 500mm deep, it's quite tight. So I've been looking at building a new rack mount server, and the main difficulty I've found is it's really hard to get short depth cases that have hot swap drive bays, which is what I really want. This case here from Server Case UK is by far the shortest depth case with hot swap drive bays I've found, and it looks really cool. So they've kindly sent one over for me to take a look at for this video, and I'll be building myself a new server in it. So we'll take a look at the parts I'm putting in shortly, but first of all we'll do a quick run through of this case. This is made by Logic Case, which is Server Case's own brand, and it's a 4U case with 8 hot swap drive bays, and it's only 400mm deep, which is really short depth. Now obviously you can't see any hot swap drive bays at the moment, and that's because it also comes with this locking front panel, so this can be locked to secure the front panel to prevent casual tampering. It obviously won't protect someone who's determined or stop someone stealing the whole machine, but if you've got it in like a cupboard in an office, for example, where standard staff are going to be going in and out, and you don't want them fiddling with the drive bays or being able to access the buttons on the front, this prevents them accessing it, so you can just lock it with a key that's supplied here. This just pulls off, so we can just pull it like that, and that will then come out, and the whole thing just lifts off, so you just take this whole panel off, and either take it off just to access the bays, or just leave it off if you don't want it. And now here we have the case. So here you can see the layout. We've got the 8 hot swap drive bays at the top, which are 3.5-inch bays, and then you can see down here there's this big empty space which is for ventilation, with a pair of USB ports and a bunch of LEDs and buttons. So you can see how they're achieving the short depth here by locating the drive bays above the motherboard area and allowing the motherboard to extend under the drive base slightly. And this allows this case to take up to extended ATX motherboards, so even in such a short depth case with hot swap bays, you can still fit really deep motherboards. So if you want a full-on dual socket system, you can actually fit it in this case. Price-wise it's not too bad. It currently retails for £138 including VAT, which for a rack mount case is pretty reasonable, as long as it's decent quality, so we'll take a look at that later. But from what I've seen so far, I'm pretty happy with it. So yep, you've got your drive bays here. Each of these has a tray in it, so it does properly use trays. It's not one of those stupid flimsy trayless systems. There's the trays there, which feel reasonable quality. They're not, the most insane things in the world, but they're pretty good. And they've also got screw holes here if you want to mount a 2.5-inch drive as well. So you can fit 2.5 or 3.5-inch drives in this. And then it's got proper light pipes to carry the LEDs through from the back and have them on the front, which is pretty good. So you've got those 8 bays there. Down the front you've got this mesh which allows you to fit 4 80mm fans behind it. There aren't any fans installed just now, but you could fit them in if you wanted. Down the bottom we can see we have a pair of USB ports, one's USB 3 and one's USB 2. A bunch of LEDs, so we've got LEDs for power, hard drive activity, 3 network indicator LEDs and a fault LED, and then a reset button and a power button. So this is really good, so you've got your front USB, and you've also got a decent number of LEDs. It's not like a normal consumer desktop case where you're going to have a power LED and a drive LED. With this you've got additional LEDs for fault and network activity, so as long as you've got a motherboard that supports them, which most server motherboards will, probably not on the desktop motherboard front, you can actually connect that up and have more LEDs, which is pretty cool. So now let's pop the top off and take a look inside the case. So it normally has 4 screws on the side which you can take out. You can obviously use them to actually lock the case shut or remove them, but even with them removed, it's still held in with these 2 buttons here, so you can't take the top off. So you then push these buttons down and pull the top back. So I would generally leave those side screws out, and it gives you toolless access to the inside. This piece of metal is quite thick. It's not too bad. The edges aren't sharp, they're a bit rough is the best way to describe it. So it's not like painful or cutting me rubbing my hand along it. It just feels a bit rough to the touch, so it's not too bad. It's not going to cut you or anything. It's just a little bit of a rough finish, but that's fine. And this does feel really thick, which is good. So with that off, we can see inside the case. So first of all, if we take a look around the back, we see we've got a power supply bay here for a standard ATX power supply. However, it actually has this sort of plate fitted in it to allow you to fit different types of power supplies. And it came with a box of accessories. Now, unfortunately, it didn't come with any sort of instructions, which is a bit annoying, so I don't know what all these are for. But for example, you've got these two plates here, which you can take this ATX one out and replace it with these instead. So these would be for things like potentially fitting maybe 2U or 1U power supplies, or for fitting redundant power supplies. You could possibly use these brackets. It's a little bit unfortunate it doesn't come with any instructions because I don't really know what these are for. However, it does mean that if you were fitting different types of power supply that weren't standard ATX, you do have mounting options. There's also other bits here. For example, you've got this one here with like a fan on it, which again, don't really know what that's for. Don't know if you clip that over one of these for certain types of power supplies. Not 100% sure. You've then got like a little bracket like that, one of those, that, whatever that is, and then a pair of little angles like that. So you've definitely got a few different options for mounting things like power supplies, but it would be nice to have instructions to actually show me what to do with this. But hopefully if you have a sort of fairly standard sized power supply, you can probably cobble something together out of these to make it fit. It then comes with a bunch of screws all in individual bags, which is really good. It's not one big jumble of screws all in one, to put all the rest of the hardware in. And obviously you've then got that key for the front panel as well that comes with it. So that is pretty good to see that you can actually fit different types of power supplies. So if you want a redundant power supply, you can actually fit that into this case. Just a shame there's no real instructions. Next up, we've got a pair of 80mm fans. Unfortunately, these are only 3-pin fans, so you're not going to have PWM speed control. So we'll try them out and see how loud they are, but I might end up having to replace these with speed-controlled fans if they're going to be too loud. But they're just standard 80mm fans there. You've got your ATX I/O shield cutout, and then a bunch of expansion slots. Unfortunately, these aren't reusable blanking plates. They're the cheaper type that you have to break out and then you can't put back in. So that's a bit of a shame. At this price point, I would have much rather seen like reusable blanking plates screwed in. I mean, if it came to it, you can obviously just break all these out, buy reusable ones, and fit all the reusable ones yourself. But at a price point of over £100, I would have rather seen reusable blanking plates. So inside the case, you can see the drive backplanes. We've got two separate backplanes. There's no sort of SAS expander or anything like that. And each backplane takes a single Molex for power, and then each of them has a single mini SAS SFF 8087 connector. So you just need to make sure you get an appropriate cable to carry data from this port here, either to your motherboard or your RAID controller or your HBA or anything like that. So I'll be using a pair of SFF 8087 cables to go from this to my SAS HBA, which we'll be taking a look at shortly. Outside of that, you've then just got some standard pin headers. So you've got this set of pin headers here for all the front LEDs and buttons. So you've obviously got way more than you have in a normal case because you've got all those additional LEDs. They're all labelled, which is quite nice. And then down here you've got this interesting looking USB header. So I need to investigate how this works, but what I'm seeing here is you've got a USB 3 header, and you've also got a USB 2 header, but the USB 2 header is wired for 2 ports. So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm wondering if this lets you connect, if you've got a USB 3 motherboard, you can plug that one in on its own and connect both of them up at with one of them running at USB 3 speeds. And if you've only got a USB 2 motherboard, you can potentially connect this one up and have them both work at USB 2 speeds. I'll need to validate that to check that's definitely the case, but if it is, that's a really nice solution. Because I've had cases before that have a USB 3 header and a separate USB 2 header, and if you've not got a USB 3 capable motherboard, the front USB 3 port's just useless, it doesn't work at all. So hopefully that would mean that if you've only got a USB 2 motherboard, you might actually be able to get both ports working, which would be really cool. So there you go, that was an overview of the case, and I'm actually really happy with it. It feels reasonably well made, definitely very sturdy. It's a little bit sharp around the edges, but I don't have any concerns about its strength or the ability to hold components well. And yeah, it seems like a really good case, especially with such a short depth, with loads of room to work inside. So what we'll now do is get this giant case out of the way, and take a look at the rest of the parts we'll be putting in. So now before we dig into all the hardware that you see here, we'll go into my use case for this machine. My current server is running bare FreeBSD, but I'm essentially just using it as a NAS. I'm storing files on it, accessing them over the network, and all I have on it really is a single virtual machine that runs simple Docker containers to run my home automation and central heating system. So I've decided that rather than installing a bare OS again, I'm going to give FreeNAS a go. So FreeNAS will handle all the basic NAS functionality of the machine really well, and it'll be much easier to set up. And it nowadays also allows you to run Beehive virtual machines, so I'll still be able to set up that single virtual machine to host Docker containers. So FreeNAS looks like a really promising option, and I've been playing with it elsewhere, so I'm really excited to try it on my home server. So now let's go through all the components we'll be using. So we'll start off with the core ones. So here we've got the CPU, which is an Intel Xeon E3-1226V3. And people who are observant will realise this is a CPU out of my old server. My old server was absolutely fine for performance, I just wanted a different form factor and a bit more expandability. so there's no point in me spending a lot of money on a new CPU, so I'm going to just reuse this. This is a Haswell refresh chip, roughly equivalent to an i5, and it still works brilliantly. It's quad core, performance is absolutely fine. The 6 on the end indicates that this has integrated graphics, so it's got integrated Intel HD graphics. That was used on my old server, the motherboard used the integrated graphics. On this new one that won't be used because the motherboard has integrated video. However, it'll just be disabled, so there's no problem using this CPU. If I was buying a CPU from scratch, I wouldn't need to buy one with integrated video, but there's no harm in using it. So that CPU we'll be reusing. Next up we have the RAM, which we have here, which is a pair of 8GB sticks of unregistered ECC DDR3. So that gives a total of 16GB of RAM, which is absolutely plenty for what I'm doing. The Docker virtual machine won't use much at all, and the rest of that can be used for FreeNAS caching. And obviously, there's 2 sticks, there's 4 slots on the motherboard, so I can easily expand it in the future. Speaking of the motherboard, we have this here, which I bought second hand, and it's an ASUS P9D C/4L. And this is a really nice server board. So I didn't want to use a desktop board in this. I get weirdly twitchy when I'm using desktop hardware in a server. There's no real problem for home use like I'm using here. I just much prefer using server grade hardware. So that's what this board is here. It uses the Intel C224 chipset, which is one of their server chipsets designed for those Xeons, and it's got a lot of server functionality rather than being a more desktop oriented board. So if we take a look at the I/O on the board, we can see it's much more designed for a server rather than a desktop use case. So you can see over here we've got a PS2 port, a pair of USB 2 ports, a pair of USB 3 ports, and a VGA port. You've not got any other video, but that's absolutely fine. Generally in a data center environment, everything still uses VGA for video, so that's pretty common. If you've got a KVM switch or a crash cart or something like that, you're going to be using VGA on it still. There's then 4 Intel NICs. These use the Intel i210 gigabit chipset, so these will be really high quality, high stability NICs on this machine. Next over here you'll see an additional network interface. This isn't a standard network interface. This is the onboard management controller on this board that we'll take a look at in a second. And notice because it's a server board, you've not got things like onboard audio or I don't know, anything like that. It's literally just all the network interfaces and USB. So it's a lot simpler for that. Take a look at the rest of the board. You can see we've got standard 24-pin power and additional 8-pin EPS, 4 RAM slots and the CPU socket. This Molex connector here is actually an output, so you would not want to connect this to your power supply or you're going to cause a bit of a problem. This would be if you wanted to have Molex coming out the motherboard and going off to like a drive back plane, which is what you would do in some cases. Certain cases wouldn't really have the ability to route a cable from the power supply to the drive back plane, and instead you would generally pull that from the motherboard and bring that up. So that's what that is there. Expansion slot wise, it's pretty good. You've got a 16x PCIe slot, an 8x PCIe slot, a pair of 1x slots, and a pair of legacy PCI slots. I would have rather seen more PCI Express rather than PCI, but this is just of a generation where they were just switching over and getting rid of PCI, but it's not too bad. I'm not going to need all these slots, so that's fine. This slot at the top here looks like PCIe 1X, but it's actually not. It's labelled MIO1. This is for a weird ASUS multi-IO card that gives you things like the onboard audio. It gives you the audio, the hardware that would normally be on the motherboard that's not on this one, on a little card, but I don't really need that. I'm not going to use audio on this machine, obviously. You've then got the chipset over here, 6 onboard SATA ports, I think you've got 2 SATA 3 and 4 SATA 2s. You've then got a bunch of I/O for the front panel. There's obviously a lot more connectors here for all those different front panel LEDs and buttons. USB 3 header as well as a USB 2 header. Integrated USB-A port, so you can use that with a flash drive to boot certain OSs, so you plug that straight into there. And then interestingly down here you'll see a bunch of 8 SATA ports, or these are actually SAS ports to be more precise. Now these ports aren't actually active, and they're to do with this weird slot down the bottom here. This is for an additional card that ASUS sell called a Pike card, which is essentially a RAID card or a host bus adapter depending on what model you buy. You slot it into this slot here, across this slot and this one here, and it enables these SAS or SATA ports. Now I'm not going to be using this slot. I looked into it, but the ASUS Pike cards cost about the same as a much better PCI Express HBA, and I decided to go for a normal PCI Express HBA purely because it would be more useful. If I got a Pike card it would work with this board, but I wouldn't be able to easily move it into other systems or reuse it in the future, so going with a more standardised card made more sense. The only other interesting thing you might notice on this board is this chip here, which is the ASpeed AST 2300 management controller. This chip contains a full CPU and network interface as well as a video adapter, and that allows you to remotely manage the system. So this is what's handling the onboard video to that VGA port, but it could also do things like allow you to get a web interface pulled up that's served from this chip, letting you remotely reboot the machine, let you get a remote console on the machine, mount virtual media, all that stuff. You'll also notice that next to this you've got this little RAM chip here, and then this little header labelled ASMB7. Unfortunately, the way this works is this does not work as a management controller out of the box. So currently in this configuration, it just works as a video adapter. If I wanted to use this as an actual management controller, I would need to buy an additional module from ASUS that slots down onto this header here and enables it. As far as I can tell, the way that would work is that effectively that little module contains the flash memory that holds the firmware for the chip. So currently the chip is running, but it's not actually got any management controller firmware on it, so it won't actually work as a management controller. The actual chips aren't too bad. They're maybe I think 20 odd quid from eBay, so I'm not too bothered about the price. But I'm not going to bother with one right now because the system sits in my living room. It's not like I need to remotely manage it. I can literally just walk over to it. So yeah, just bear in mind if you are buying this sort of board, you do get the onboard management controller, but you do need that additional little module if you actually want to enable the management functionality of it. But apart from that, it actually looks like a really nice board, so I'm definitely dead excited to try this out. As for the rest of the hardware, we've got some other parts. So we've got some cooling here. That case does come with a pair of 80mm fans in the rear, but I've tried them out and they are really quite loud, so I wouldn't want to use them in a home environment. They'd be fine in a server room or a room where the machine's hidden away from people, and it's definitely a lot quieter than lots of servers that I've heard, but they're still too loud to have in my living room. So I've gone out and bought these two Noctua 80mm fans. So typical overkill Noctua packaging, but these are pretty nice fans. They're the NFA8, and they're pretty nice quality 80mm fans, so these should be a lot quieter. And unlike the ones that are provided with the case, these are 4-pin PWM fans, so even if they're a bit loud out of the box, I can control the speed and software, which will be pretty cool. So I've got two of those to replace those fans that came with the case. As far as the CPU cooling, I didn't want to reuse the cooler from the old server because it had a back plate and all that sort of stuff, and I'd rather just not faff about with that. I thought I'd buy another cooler just to play about with it really. So I picked this one up, which is that model there from Silverstone, and it's a 2U server cooler. So essentially this is a really short height tower cooler. So hopefully this will perform a bit better than the old cooler in the old case, which is like an Intel stock cooler more. So that's it there. It's this tiny little, baby-sized tower cooler with direct contact copper heat pipes, which should be really good. They go through all the fins here, and you've got this tiny little 60mm fan on the front, and that'll sit on the CPU. I couldn't go with a conventional tall tower cooler, because even though that case is quite tall, the drive bays do sit over the CPU slot slightly, so you've only got really about 10 centimeters off the board to fit a cooler. So this cooler was quite a decent option, and it's way smaller than that, so that should fit perfectly. And again, it's got a 4-pin PWM fan, so it should be relatively quiet. That's cooler there, and all it comes with, apart from that, is just a little backplate in the box as well. They also do a version of this that's about the same price, or maybe even cheaper actually, that uses push pins to clip through the motherboard. But I decided to go to the backplate version just because I feel it's maybe more secure than push pins that can maybe pop out in transit, so I went for this. Next up we've got the storage, and for that I went for four 4TB HGST Ultrastar hard drives. These are really good quality server drives. They're designed for data center or server use, unlike lots of desktop drives, and I got a ridiculously good deal on these. So when I bought these drives, I bought them listed as used or like seller refurbished, which essentially means a seller's taken it, wiped it down, formatted it, and gone, oh yeah, it works. If you're lucky, they've maybe tested it. However, so I bought them, they're about 58 quid each, which was a pretty average price for a drive of this sort of being used, but I thought that was a pretty decent deal and it'll do the job. But what actually turned up wasn't some used seller refurbished hard drives. They were completely sealed, and as you can see there, they're actually refurbished by HGST themselves. So these are proper manufacturer refurbished drives, which, to be honest, I generally regard as in the same league as new drives. The manufacturers fully tested these, approved them, reconditioned them, and these are the sort of drives they'll send out as warranty replacements usually. So for 58 quid, it was a ridiculous deal because these drives new cost anywhere between 150 and 170. So getting them for 58 quid each was ridiculous. In fact, I first of all only bought two because I didn't really need that much storage, but because they were so cheap, I bought out the rest of their stock and bought an additional two because 58 quid for these drives, even though they're refurbished, they're proper manufacturer refurbished drives, so 58 quid is an absolute steal for these. So that's the main storage there. Then to run FreeNAS we need a separate disk. Normally people just run it off a USB stick, which I could have done and just plugged into the motherboard's USB port. However, I've got piles of spare SSDs lying around, so I decided just to reuse one. So I'm just going to use this basic Corsair Force LS 60GB drive. It's not remotely special at all, but I just feel this is potentially a bit more reliable than the cheap flash drive, so I thought I'll give this a go and install FreeNAS on it. So we'll be installing that SSD there. Next up we've got the power supply. So for that I'm again reusing a part I already had, which is this pretty decent 300 watt FSP. It's nothing special, but it's 80 plus bronze, and it is from a reputable brand. FSP aren't hugely well known in the retail market, but they're a big manufacturer of OEM power supplies. It's a really good quality unit, it's got all the I/O I'd need, and yeah, it's absolutely fine. Again, I already had it available, and there was no point in spending money on a part I didn't really need. So next up we've got the storage controller, and for that I'm using this Dell PERC H310. This is one of Dell's lower end RAID cards, but I've picked it for a very specific reason. One of the cards that's quite commonly used for FreeNAS is the LSI 9211-8i SAS HBA, and used there maybe about 40 to 50 quid, maybe up to 60 quid. And they use the LSI SAS 2008 chipset. Coincidentally, the PERC H310 also uses the LSI SAS 2008 chipset, and even though out of the box it runs some sort of Dell firmware that does loads of weird RAID functionality and it's a really bad RAID card and all that sort of stuff, you can very easily flash this to run the LSI IT, which stands for Initiator Target firmware, which means that this will act as a basic SAS HBA. It will have no RAID functionality, none of that. It will just take the drives and pass them directly through to the OS, which is exactly what you want for FreeNAS and the ZFS file system. And the key thing is that these PERC cards are a lot cheaper. I paid 25 quid for this card. So I've bought this card, I've already flashed it, so this is now running the LSI firmware, so it works just like an LSI card, but cost me a lot less. You'll notice that here I've modded a little fan onto it. That's obviously not original. So currently out of the box it comes with this little piddly little heatsink. Now that's fine for lots of high airflow servers, so all your 1 or 2U servers that have huge amounts of airflow going through them will cool this card fine. However, in more of a desktop case or in a situation like this where there's not going to be that much airflow through the case because I want to keep it relatively quiet, you run the risk of this card overheating because it's not got a very big heatsink. So I've just mounted this little Nokia 40mm fan that I already had spare to that. I'll plug it into a motherboard header and that'll just keep constant airflow over that heatsink to keep the card cool. In the back you can see you've got these two connectors, which are also mini SAS connectors, a little blanker in there, and that's a pair of mini SAS connectors that can go up to the backplane on the motherboard. To connect it up, I'm just going to use these cables here. So I've got a pair of SAS cables that will go between this card here and the backplane in the case. So yeah, that's a look at all the hardware we'll be putting in. So now let's go and build this thing. So what I'll do is I'll do a sort of time lapse of me building it, show a few things. I'll come back at the end and give my impressions of how the build went and how I found the case. as you can see, the build's now complete. And I've been running it for about a week or maybe 2 weeks, and it works brilliantly. So I've got it all set up now running FreeNAS, and on that I'm using that as a NAS, and then I've got a single Beehive virtual machine that I'm running some Docker containers in that I use for my home automation system. And I'm really impressed with how well this thing works. So what we'll do now is we'll go around the outside of the case, then we'll take a look inside and see how I've built it, and I'll talk about a few things that I found while building in this. But overall, I'm very impressed. So as you can see on the front of the case, it looks like it did before, but now we've got the drives in, so if we pull each of these out, each of the 4 top bays has one of the 4TB Hitachi Ultrastar drives in it. One thing to note is the drive numbering on this is a bit different from lots of servers, because on lots of servers you've got a single backplane, so your drives are usually numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. On this, because you've got the 2 backplanes, it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Doesn't make a huge difference, it's just worth bearing in mind if you're trying to remember the numbers of the bays when you're working with your RAID card or your HBA card. So that's absolutely fine. Down here you've got the big mesh, which turns out has a dust filter inside it. Now, I'm always a bit wary about dust filters on servers, especially like this where it's not particularly easy to remove. You have to remove quite a lot of screws to get to it. So I'll see how I get on, because if that gets clogged up it might be a pain to clean. And generally with servers I tend not to have air filters and just rely on a lot of air extracting through it to remove all the dust. So I'll see how I get on. If it turns out to be a pain, what you can just quite easily do is remove the screws and just remove this dust filter if you want to. It's also obviously got that locking front panel that you can fit. I've decided to leave that off just because I prefer the look of it without that. You get to see all the LEDs and stuff. And to be honest, for me, because it's not in a non-secure environment, I don't need to worry about people accessing the server, so I'd rather just leave it open to make it easier for me to access it. But yeah, that's around the front. Take a look around the back, you'll see the rear I/O, which you probably saw during the build, but anyway. Now, one thing you'll notice is it's sitting on a bit of cardboard. That's something really important to bear in mind, is that the bottom of this case is really sharp for some reason. It's got a lot of sharp edges, and I've put quite a nasty scratch on my table, which is a bit annoying. So I'm trying to keep it on a bit cardboard for now. So it's worth bearing that in mind. I mean, it's not an issue for me because this is a cheap IKEA table I just use for filming. But if you had this on like a nice oak dining room table and you did that, you could take quite a nasty scratch out of it. So be careful. But here we can see around the back of the server. So you see we've got the power supply here, the 2 Noctua fans, which I've now mounted on the anti-vibration rubber mounts. We'll talk about the fans later, but I originally screwed these in, but I've now used the anti-vibration mounts. And down the bottom you can see the motherboard I/O. So you've seen the board before, but we've got PS2, pair of USB 2, Ethernet for management that isn't enabled because I've not got that management card, pair of USB 3, VGA, and then 4 Intel Gigabit NICs. As for expansion cards, we can see that most of them are empty, apart from the one slot containing that PERC H310 that's flashed to be an LSI HBA. So the outside's a bit boring, now let's pop it open and see what's inside. So we can just use the quick release on the lid because I've left those screws out the side. And now we can see inside the machine. So now we can see inside the case, and I'm really impressed with how neat this turned out. So over here we've got the power supply connected to the motherboard, and then it connects up with these 2 Molexes to the back planes. So apart from a single SATA cable going over to the SSD, all the power cabling is located over to this side, which is quite neat, so you've not got cables snaking everywhere. You've then obviously got the CPU cooler, which I really like. I was a bit dubious about this thing, or whether I should go for just a stock cooler or something with a fan on top that blows down. But this cooler is actually really good. It fits neatly in there, there's loads of clearance around it, it's dead quiet when it's not running at full speed, and it cools the CPU really well, so I really like this cooler. And with the screw mounting to a back plate rather than the push pins, I feel it's really secure, so I don't need to worry about it popping out or anything, so I really like this little cooler. Over here we've then got those 2 SAS cables that go around here and then connect into the HBA. The cables are a bit long, so they just sort of snake along here, come back and then go down. That's absolutely fine. The HBA is sitting there with its fan retrofitted onto it, and then the cable comes from the fan and just plugs into the motherboard header down there. And that keeps the HBA perfectly cool. I've not tried to actually read temperatures from this because I don't quite know how you do that. I don't know if you need weird software or if that's even possible if it's got a temperature sensor. But I know that without the fan, if you put your finger on that heatsink after it running for a while, it was actually too hot to touch, like it would burn your finger. But with that fan on there, you can run it for hours, do full stress tests, touch that and it's slightly warm. So that seems to cool it absolutely fine. Next up over here, we've got the only real bodge I did, which is the SSD. Because this case doesn't have any 2.5-inch drive mounts, all it's got is those 8 hot swap bays, which is pretty much expected. So all I did for the SSD, it's just a basic 60 gig one, is I've used a pair of Velcro command strips just to stick it to the side of the case. And they're incredibly strong, so they're not going to come off at all. And that holds it completely securely there. There is other options you could potentially do. You can get brackets that can fit two M.2 SSDs into an expansion bay and either run them on the PCI bus or just let you connect a pair of SATA cables to connect them to the motherboard. And that would be a bit neater to keep it out of the way, but this was a much cheaper and easier to do option, so that's Velcro to the side there, and that works fine. As for space working in this case, it's actually really good. I was a little bit concerned because of all this overhang here, but for this board here, which is a single CPU ATX board, it was fine. I built the board out the case, slotted it in, the cooler had to hook under slightly, but it was okay, and it fitted fine. The only difficulty I really found was trying to screw in the front screws for the motherboard. All I needed to do for that though was just to take the bits out of my screwdriver and literally hold the screwdriver bit in my fingers, slide it in and do it by hand, and that was fine. So for this ATX board, you're absolutely fine. You could actually even probably possibly upgrade the CPU, you could definitely access your RAM and all that stuff. I even did all the front panel I/O with the board in the case and it didn't cause any problems. The only time you might run into any issues is if you had an extended ATX dual socket board, which would extend much further under this drive bay. In that case, you can actually remove the drive bays. It's not a super simple procedure, which is why I didn't do it to build this, although I have done it before when I first got the case just to try it out. But there's a bunch of screws down the side you can remove, and then this whole assembly does come out. So if you were trying to do it and you didn't want to take the whole board out, or you're working with a really large motherboard, you can actually remove these drive bays if you needed to. It's not the easiest process, but it is definitely possible. As for cooling, I fitted the two Nokia fans in the back because the original fans were far too loud. So I put these in and I've mounted them on the anti-vibration rubber mounts to keep them a bit quieter. The only difficulty I really had was the sort of fan speed control of these. So I bought these because they're PWM fans and connected them to the PWM headers on the motherboard. However, unfortunately, for some reason with this motherboard, the fan control is really rubbish. You can set different speeds in the BIOS, but they apply to absolutely all the fan headers. And the problem was, if I were to set the fan speed to make these fans run at a reasonable speed, the CPU fan would go to sort of jet engine speed and be really loud. And if I ran it slower so the CPU fan was acceptable, these rear fans would spin at like 300 RPM and barely move any air. Apparently it's possible to get finer grained fan control through the IPMI interface, so I could buy that additional management card, fit that in, and that would maybe allow me better fan control. But all I've done for now is I've just disconnected the fourth pin for these PWM fans, so they're connected straight into the motherboard with 3 pins, and they run at full speed all the time. But to be honest, these fans are so quiet that I'm happy running them at full speed. Even in my living room, sitting across the room from me, they're completely quiet when they're inside the rack. So these fans just run at full speed, move a huge amount of air, keep everything nice and cool. Works brilliantly. To power these fans, what I've had to do is this motherboard's got stupid fan layout. So one fan is connected directly to the motherboard down here. The other fan goes to a fan extension that routes under the board and round and plugs in over here. But that works fine now they're in. Mounting the fans was pretty easy. The only difficulty I had was with these Nokia fans is that this case has the fans mounted quite closely together, which for a basic plastic fan's fine, but they sit right against each other. And these Nokias have little anti-vibration rubber bumpers on them. They do fit, but there was a little bit of wiggling involved to try and get them in, so it was a little bit tricky to persuade these to go in, but now they're in, they're fine, they are just sort of squeezed right up against each other, but it works okay. The only real difficulty I had with the case apart from that was just the LED headers. So all of them were fine, apart from the LED for network port 3. And that's because all the network LEDs come on a 2-pin header. So essentially it's one of these little motherboard headers with 2 pins going directly into it. On this board, that's absolutely fine, apart from network LED 3, where rather than having 2 pins next to each other on the motherboard, you've got 2 pins with like space in between. And that meant that the 2-pin header wouldn't work. It wasn't a big problem because it was a connector like this, or one with 2 pins on it instead. So all I did was pop one of them out, take a casing off of one of these, so just this single pin casing, slot it over, and then that made it into 2 separate pins and plugged in. So that was fine. I don't know where the blame lies with that. I think it's probably the motherboard. It's a bit of a stupid layout putting a space in between on a single LED. But apart from that, it works fine. All the LEDs connected up brilliantly and all work fine. The only other real thing to bear in mind that's not a huge problem, but just something I sort of noticed when I was working with it, is the way the airflow works. And that's because you've got this big open space under here, where the motherboard can extend into, with your drive bays up the top. So this means that your airflow through the case has to cool the drives and the motherboard. But because you've got this big open space here, the majority of the air is going to flow through here and not across the hard drives. I've checked the temperatures on this and it's fine. With the Nokia fans running at full speed, the hard drive temperatures are completely safe. But these are only 7200 RPM drives. So if you're going to fit maybe 5400 RPM SAS drives, you maybe just want to be a bit more careful about the airflow across them. One very hacky option you could do that would definitely work would be maybe to try and obstruct the airflow here slightly. So currently this whole area is open. So what you could potentially even do is have some way to blank off maybe, you know, the edges of that and just leave the front open to cool the CPU, and that would allow more air to be directed across the drives. So it's not really a big problem, it's just worth bearing in mind if you're trying to fit really hot running hard drives in here, that you might want to figure out the airflow, or just take a bit of care with it. But apart from that, I absolutely love this build. The case has actually worked really well, I'm dead impressed with it. And the layout, I absolutely love it, I'm really impressed. So yeah, that's my new home server build. So we just put it back together, and then get it back in the rack. So there we go, that's the server now installed in the rack and working brilliantly. And I'm so happy with how this thing turned out, I absolutely love it. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and if you're interested in buying this case, there's a link to buy it from Server Case UK in the video description. Thanks for watching.